Today, I am excited to introduce Gavin Grounds. He is the Executive Director of Governance, Risk, and Compliance at Verizon. Gavin isn't only a friend, he's also a pioneer in cyber risk quantification. It seems like a topic you wouldn't normally associate with data mesh, but when you start thinking about how Gavin has applied his pioneering thoughts for quantifying risk, and you try to apply or sit back and think, how might I do that in a mesh? I think you're going to find it a really interesting conversation because there's some things in his model that I think relate directly to the mesh and some things that we may be able to use right away. Let's see how it goes. Yeah, Gavin, we've been friends for a while, and I know that we're both runners. We both run marathons. I think you're probably running one tomorrow, if I'm not mistaken, there in New York. But here's what's interesting is we take different approaches. We start at different places. I think you train a lot. And my secret is I don't train at all. I run one marathon a year. I show up in that morning and I run. And the reason I do that is because I have a bad knee. And if I run more than 3 miles, it swells up for 3 months. And so two different approaches. We start in different places, but you know what? We're still on the same path and we still finish the marathon. And I think there's something to be said about that because it's not where we start, it's the path that we follow. And I think for the most part, we're following a structured path. And we do a lot of the same things. We hydrate, we stay in shape, and we're focused. And I think when you think about the data mesh, sometimes if you're on the business side, it feels like you're running a marathon. But I think if you've got that structure, one, you can get across the finish line. But two, if you do it right, you can get there really, really fast. And that's what we're talking about is getting there really, really fast. So Gavin, thank you for joining us. Welcome to the show. There you are.
It's great to be here, Adrian. Thanks for inviting me. And just to be clear, don't be overly impressed. I'm not running the New York Marathon
You're
tomorrow.
not okay.
No, I am in New York.
Mhm.
I am running the TED Cup at 15K tomorrow in Central
Wow.
Park. But that is part of my overall training. So my next marathon will be the Austin Marathon in February, followed
Nice.
in March by the Los Angeles Marathon. So yeah, so I just want everyone to be overly impressed, saying, "Wow, this has been recorded a few weeks ago, and he's running the New York Marathon this week."
Well, it's still impressive. I think they're more impressed now that you're running so many races. Given before we get started talking deeper about the data mesh, let's start by talking about your model. Tell us just a little bit about your cyber risk quantification model.
Yeah, so it's I think it's good to start with just describing what cyber risk quantification is not
Okay.
in my model.
Yeah.
And a lot of times when we think about cyber risk quantification, a lot of companies think immediately of like trying to calculate ALE, annualized loss expectancy, almost like
Right.
the insurance model. It's like, hey, I'm your CISO, you pay me a premium, and I'm going to put these controls in place and hopefully help you avoid spend or losing or unplanned spend of X times millions of dollars that you gave me as a CISO.
Mhm.
That's not quantification for me. And I'll tell you very simply the reason why it's not is when we think about that model of trying to calculate annualized loss expectancy, it really doesn't answer the question, or it's not the only answer to the question.
Mhm.
Real simple example: at home, I don't do the cooking. If I did, my family would all be poisoned to death. So when I'm at home, my wife does the cooking. So say for example, if she's doing a roast dinner, and she'll say to me, "How hungry are you?" Well, if I respond and say, "I'm pretty hungry," that doesn't answer the question. That's like saying, how much risk do we have? Oh, it's medium. It doesn't really give a true answer to the question. What she's really asking me is, how many potatoes do you want? Right.
Yeah.
So now I might think about, is that a Texas russet potato, or is it an Idaho potato? Because my answer might then be different as to how many I want. But what she's looking for is an empirical numeric value. How many do I want? So I might say, oh yeah, I'm pretty hungry after three. Now, therefore, thinking about why I say risk quantification in cyber is not answered exclusively by annualized loss expectancy, is she could ask me that same question, how hungry are you? How many potatoes do you want? And if I said I want $3.28 worth of potatoes, it doesn't answer the question. Mathematically, it might be the correct answer, but it doesn't answer the question. So putting things into a
Mhm.
fiscal view exclusively in the fiscal view of potential loss, for me, that's not what risk quantification is. What it is, though, is getting out of the realms of low, medium, high, critical, or red, amber, green, and calculating risk and enumerating risk specifically in an empirical numeric way, an
Right.
empirical numeric fashion, because then you can actually do essentially an enterprise roll up view of what your overall portfolio of risk is. So I thought it was just worth pointing that out, Adrian, that, and especially, some of the things that you and I've chatted about previously, and no doubt we'll talk a little bit about today,
Yeah.
why for me to be able to provide and produce that empirical numeric value representation of cyber risk, I'm explicitly dependent, rather. I'm explicitly dependent on getting access to data,
Yeah.
and getting access to data in near real time, and being able to contextualize that data in the context of the business and mission criticality.
Let's talk about data because there's three areas that I want to dig into. And if we study the data mesh with your lenses, again, I want to talk about first and foremost how we quantify risk. Because whether you're talking vulnerabilities or whether you're firewalls or whatever, you get to a point where it's way too much data, right? It's too much to look at, it's too much to manage. On the data side, when we try to look at data sets and you look at high confidentiality or you look at low risk data or whatever, however you want to frame it up, you never get there. You never catch up. And for teams that are driving big master data management projects or big data quality projects, they're boiling the ocean over here, so to speak, and there's almost no end in sight. When you come back and say, stop, let's start looking at this different. If you're going to quantify risk, if you're going to quantify data, you got to make sure you're looking at it at the right level. And I think that's where your model starts. It says, hold on a second. And I think there's a quote that you had that I really like. It says, start where you are, or something like that, and then figure it out. Don't try to, jump or skip steps, so to speak, right? Let's take a really fair understanding for where we are. And so for any data organization, that first step is, okay, where am I? What does data mean to me? And once you kind of start thinking about how that data is structured or what that data means to your business teams, then you can say, okay, how do I quantify it? How do I quantify data? So the first part is quantifying it. But even more importantly, Gavin, this is the thing that I think is the big difference. You can't quantify something that's not structured. If I've got 1 million data sources, or that's probably 2 million, right? But that's what we all have collectively, 1 million data sources, and we're trying to quantify risk or trying to measure anything across that, you're never going to get there. Too many variables, too many differences. If we bring data onto that marathon path, if we bring data onto a mesh where you've got a framework and a standard, and it's all kind of following the same rules, you at least have a fighting chance. So I think before you quantify anything, you got to start with a structure. You've got to have a common structure to work on. And if you've got that, then I think you're ready for the next step. And I think that next step, if we go on, is going to be then trying to put that in a business context. So now I'm measuring data in the right way on a structure, and now it's about trying to put it into business context. You talk about, I think you said something about quantifying the asset, not the server, if I'm quoting you correctly. And that resonated with me because I was an old security guy, and that made a lot of sense. You're sitting in front of a leader trying to explain vulnerabilities on a bunch of servers, and they're saying, and you say, who cares, right? Talk a bit about how you view the difference between quantifying the minutia, so to speak, and then putting it into terms that somebody understands. And when you're starting to quantify the asset, what does asset mean to you, and how do you quantify that for the business?
Yeah, so for me, in my model, the asset is the thing of value. So, for example, if we come from an IT space, when we think about assets, we might immediately start to think about servers and databases and application servers and firewalls and network switches and network routers and so on. And if we
Never
come
ends.
from IT, right, we just think about those as the assets. Whereas really, when we think about the asset, is the thing of value. So an asset could actually be a process,
Yeah.
and that process could be underpinned or supported by a number of systems. So yes, we've got a number of systems and maybe a number of servers, a number of kind of core network infrastructure that supports that, but they're really supporting the asset, which is foundationally or fundamentally the thing of value, that business process. And so when you start with just that view, then the model that I put into place is when I say I quantify risk with an empirical numeric value, what I really do is think about it like a points based system. Like when you collect an air miles or something, you get so many points for using your credit card, or you'll get so many air miles for flying a certain number of segments, or whatever the case might be. And so when I look at that asset, which is potentially, it could be a third party service.
Mm-hmm.
That asset could be comprised of a number of different systems and servers that perform that particular function or that particular process. So when I say, well, then, how do I then quantify with empirical numeric value of what that asset's value actually is? And so I'm not going to go to annualized loss expectancy. What I do is I say, well, what things do I know about this asset? What does it do for a living? How critical
Yeah.
really is it? And so, for example, if that particular asset is in scope for PCI, just let's say it's a card processing system, then say, okay, you're in scope for PCI, you're going to get assigned X number of points just because you're in scope for PCI. Or you can say, well, how many third-party API connections does this platform have, and what types of APIs are they pushing instructions, pulling instructions, pushing data, receiving data? And based on those choices, you say, then you're going to get some more additional points now assigned because of your architecture. Now, let's put
Right.
that into cybersecurity terms. What I've just described is essentially attack surface or exposure. We start thinking about, interconnectivity. When we talk about like PCI, I'm just using as a couple of examples of the types of elements, if you like, that I look at. Then if it's PCI in my example here, then it's like, well, what kind of regulatory scrutiny is
Yeah.
this platform under? It could be in scope for Sarbanes-Oxley. Then it's going to get some points
You know what
assigned.
I find super interesting, Gavin, is I'm listening. I'm thinking there's going to be some data folks in the call. They'll be like, "What is he talking about?" But here's the beauty of it. Here's the beauty of it, right? Because this is a real data conversation, and this is the problem we have on the data side. We sit down and we were even to try to quantify data value or data risk with a big group of people. Everyone's talking a different language, and you're talking with an export voice on the areas. You bring somebody from another business or another area, they're going to talk with their own export voice. The reason it breaks down is you can't quantify, and I'm going to steal your word, without a common language, right? So
Yeah.
step one, we said, let's quantify risk. Let's make sure we start at the right level. Use a common language. A framework gives you a common language. And step two, when you start to really use a common language and think about it, you don't make up. It's not an IT guy saying, I think this is the risk, or I think this is the value. The magic happens when you put it into that model that a business team can look at and say, I get it. I appreciate that. What's valuable to me might be different for you. What's risky for me might be different for you. You let that owner kind of measure and manage that risk. And I think that's the last step. So great. So we're quantifying on the data mesh. Now we're having, and that because a common framework and a language allows us to do that. And now we're starting to really think about data products. You're talking assets, I'm talking data products in a way that business teams can actually understand in words that they appreciate. The magic happens when then they're able to start managing it. And you use a word called optimize, which I think resonates with everybody, right? Optimizing risk, optimizing value. If they understand it, they know what to do with it. And that's the hardest thing today, I think, is people, they see the risk, but they don't see the levers. They don't see the steering wheel, so to speak. And so when you're able to give somebody that power, I get it, I understand it, common language, I see the levers. Now you're able to, are you driving risk up or are you driving risk down, Gavin? What are you doing?
Yeah, so oftentimes when we think about risk, we might immediately think that our objectives should be to reduce risk. And that's actually not the case. The risk, there's risk in everything we do in life. Every single day as humans, we're making risk decisions. And so, I often will use this example, Adrian, again, where when we start talking empirical numeric value instead of like gradients of risk. If I have a business leader and she says, "Hey, I've got this great business opportunity. It's worth $100 million." And if I say, "Well, there's $1 million worth of risk associated with that," depending on the business, she's probably going to say, "Fantastic, I'll take the 99. Thanks a
Yeah.
lot. Let's go." And in the meantime, hey, can you drive some of that risk down a little bit or optimize it? But if I say the exact same scenario, and if that business leader, she says, $100 million opportunity, and I say, well, you've got 7 critical issues in there or critical risks, you got 3 highs and 5 mediums, she might still want to go, but there's going to be that pause. I know, and she'll be like, wait, well, can we get rid of those criticals first, and then we'll move. And what we've just done by default, or by the outcome of that from a business perspective, is we've just diluted the net present value of that business opportunity because
Mm-hmm.
now we've shifted it to the right in terms of timing, and we may have also missed a first mover opportunity in a market, and yet it was the exact same scenario. Now, I did mention I'm not talking about exclusively ALE, annualized loss expectancy, but the point being is that for most of our fellow practitioners in cyber risk and information risk and cybersecurity, we do predominantly speak in low, medium, high critical or red, amber, green. We might speak 1 through 10, But when you put that, or you try to put that together and say, then therefore, what is a low plus a red plus a seven? What's the answer? We can't do that.
No.
So that again, when we get back to the quantification, I mentioned earlier about the model I have is like this points based system that says how much is this asset worth, how mission critical is it, how much regulatory scrutiny is it subject to, and by calculating an empirical numeric value, I can now stack rank and say this asset at the top here is my most critical and or my most exposed and or my most mission critical.
Yep.
And I can stack rank that now to the lowest one. So maybe the one at the bottom I would say is the cafeteria menu system. Um, but then when we think about then actionable risk, and you mentioned vulnerabilities a few minutes ago, Adrian. So, I can then do all the telemetry that we already have as a cybersecurity organization typically. We have our vulnerability scans. We see the results we're getting from our IP scans. We see the results if we're running an open source system from library based vulnerabilities. We see issues because of perhaps end of support life or end of service life. And there's a whole litany of things that we measure. But again, typically we see them in low, medium, high, critical, or a 1 through 10. So what the methodology does that I've basically operationalized now is it takes each one of those, I call it actionable risk, and equally it then gets assigned an empirical numeric value. So if you have an open source code vulnerability, and then you're going to get X number of points. If you have a system that is no longer supported by a vendor, you've got Y number of points. So if you've got missing patches, and what that then does is I can then say, okay, so for my base risk, those assets that I've now enumerated and come up with an empirical numeric value for, I could say, all right, for the top 10% of those, I'm only going to tolerate, I don't know, 10 points of actionable risk. And so what that does is it allows a delivery leader, whether it's a CIO or a third-party provider, it allows them to look at what the actual risk score is, the current operating risk score for their particular service or their particular asset, and say, all right, I've got 20 points. I'm only allowed 10. But if I go and fix this thing, that's going to benefit me by 3 points of risk. And if I go fix this thing, that's going to benefit me by 5 points of risk. So it puts the decision making and the prioritization into the hands of that delivery leader or that owner, but in the context of like where that asset shows up and its importance to the actual business itself. And so that's kind of how this really comes together. And you use the word about knowing, helping people to know which levers to pull or which levers to pull. That's what it does. It says
Yeah.
I can't do issue number 1, but I can do issues number 4, 7, and 9, and I can predict how that's going to improve now my overall risk profile.
So this is interesting. There's an echo now. There is a data product team out there thinking about how they could possibly do points on their products. And I'm while you're talking, I'm trying to make it up, thinking like, wow, that makes kind of sense. So here's what I would do, right? Let's go on the fly, right? When I think about a data product, I think about metadata, right? There's a lot of metadata elements that I can use for points. Now, at a high level, I would say if it has metadata, that's a point. If it doesn't have metadata, but I think you can go much deeper than that, right? So you can use the metadata itself to create a point system. The other element of a data product is you think about where it came from, right? There's a sense of lineage. That's an incredible metric, I think. That's, if you're talking about where it came from, you can certainly judge value and risk based on where data came from. And then there's an element in the data product that I encourage people to study because it's really, really powerful is code, how it was put together. A product isn't a data field. A product is an aggregated data set. It has real value. Somebody put it together for a purpose using code. That code also has a point system, right? But if I'm a risk guy and I'm describing products that way, I'm thinking, hey, that could work. If I'm a data guy and I'm describing data products that way, I'm thinking, that's certainly, at least you have a starting point and a methodology. And if you start to put that into some kind of an equation, it doesn't have to be differential equations, right? It could be simple algebra. It's about making it something the business can action. You've got something really good, but then somebody's looking, so what, right? What you're on one of your videos, you were talking about why. So let's say someone's saying, well, Adrian, sounds interesting. Why? I'll tell you why. One of the things that we've really struggled with as CDOs, as data managers, is data democratization. You want to start to kind of break down these big verticals. You want to get people to share data. Hard to do, right? You can share a little piece, but I don't want to share it all. What should I share? What can I share? What happens if I share, right? The thought and the fear of what's going to happen if I start to share data, because you don't have all the information to make that decision. It forces these barriers to go up. If I can start to quantify the risk, and even better, quantify the value in a way that they can understand it, man, I think we have an opportunity to make a huge impact on data democratization. And I'll give you one more. Why? Monetization. We're talking about monetizing data. How can you monetize data if you can't quantify risk or value? You can't monetize data, right? So you almost sit back and say it's a necessity, right? Am I going to get to a point where I'm really going to monetize data? I've got to quantify the risk and I've got to quantify the value in numbers the business understands. So what you and I are talking about here, Gavin, I think it's a breakthrough moment. I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah. But no, you're right. You're right there, Adrian, because you mentioned you made a comment a few minutes ago around data and kind of understanding the origin of the data or its
Yeah.
heritage. I think is what you said. But again, and this is where this view and the ability to speak with a common language and common lexicon really starts to pull together the kind of overall risk overall view of risk and risk quantification. Because also what's interesting when it comes to data, it's also what's the purpose of the data and what's its
Yeah.
function.
Yeah.
Because the data set itself might be tiny, but if the purpose of that data is to produce virtualized environments, and that small little data set is the configuration profile for creating entire virtualized environments or tearing those virtualized environments down, then when we think about that data, it's not about the volume of data, it's not about how many millions of records it's got, it's what is the purpose of this data. And then you think back to the risk quantification model that I've described. When I look at then the asset, the data becomes a component part of the asset itself. So then when we're saying, well, what is the mission criticality of this asset? What is the purpose of this data? Like I say, then we're not focused exclusively on which sometimes in cybersecurity we do. Sometimes we'll focus almost exclusively on the CIA, the confidentiality of the data or the integrity of the data or the availability of the data. But there is another element to that, and that is what is the purpose of the data? What does it do? Because there are environments out there that have very limited, in terms of volumetric, very limited data associated with them.
Yeah.
But the mission criticality of that asset or that function is so critical, and it's so dependent on that small data set. And so you bring it together in that way, Adrian, and that again now, I don't have to be a data scientist necessarily to understand, well, how do I associate risk and risk points with that data? Because I can rely on that work's already been done. The value of that data has already been assessed
Yeah.
for me. The mission criticality of that data has already been assessed. And you quoted something that you've heard me say many times about, you start with where you are. That's the only
Exactly.
place you
That's what you said. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, no, it's like this is a true story, but I've said that a few times. Some of my family from Ireland, from Limerick, and when I was a kid, my nan used to always make me laugh because if somebody asked her for directions, she'd say, "Well, I wouldn't start from here if I were you," you know, and then she'd pause for a minute and then see the person's reaction, and then she'd chuckle because he's like, "Well, okay, you wouldn't start from here if I were you. Well, where should I start from then?"
Just tell me I'm wrong.
I, but the thing is, this is the only place it can start from.
Yeah.
And so, when we do take that view, and when I've taught that view, I don't need to go and redo what's already been done. The
Right.
mission criticality of our systems has already been assessed by somebody. The business criticality of processes, if there's a business continuity plan, then somebody's concluded that that's a pretty important process for the business to keep alive. And then my job is really to say, well, so that process is the asset, or that function is the asset. So now what are the systems that support that and deliver on that asset? What are the data sets, and where are the data sets? And so a lot, like I say, all of that is starting from where you are. It's
Yeah.
starting with what you do know. And I might not personally know it,
Yeah.
but our organization knows it. And so it's starting with what you do have, and then the adage I'll often say, to my team is, you start with what you do know, you improve based on what you could know, and always aspire to what you should know,
Drop the
because there's
mic.
always going to be something that we don't know. There's always going to be something that we should have known,
Yeah.
um, but that's what we aspire to. But
I
this
think
is just
that's a great place to close, Gavin. I've heard you say that before, and every time you say it, it resonates. I think the biggest message there is you've got to start somewhere, but be smart where you start. And the second key message there is improve as you go, right? And in data, that's so true because it seems so daunting. But I think when we start to have these kinds of conversations and start to merge different ideas, and you sit back and say, actually, quantification on a data mesh is possible, right? And so you got me excited about cyber risk quantification. I hope I have you equally excited about the data mesh. But I really appreciate you joining us for this discussion. We could talk for another hour. Maybe we do another show down the road on something else, on more Irish limericks. But Gavin, really, thank you so much, my friend, my colleague, Gavin Grounds, Executive Director of Governance, Risk, and Compliance at Verizon. Thank you.
Adrian, my pleasure. Enjoyed it. And yeah, we should do this again.
Wow, that was a rich discussion with Gavin Grounds. It's interesting what happens when you bring two different topics and you try to marry them together. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't work, but I think it worked today. I think the concept of quantifying data or quantifying risk is really important. I don't know that you can actually have a data mesh unless you figure out how to do that. Gavin, a pioneer in cyber risk quantification, has figured out how to do it in his space. And I think there's some things that we can steal from his pioneering thoughts and apply to the data mesh. What we're really looking to do is we want to quantify risk on the data mesh so that we can manage it and unlock value. That's the key, right? The last two parts are the really important pieces, right? Because if you can quantify data value and data risk, then you can manage it and unlock value. And I think today, if we look across our data environments, there's a lot of data that's locked. It's locked because we can't share it. It's locked because we can't value it. It's locked because we can't see it. When you start to think about a data mesh and think about what Starburst brings to the table with the ability to connect data sets across different sources and bring it together for business teams on the front end, and everything we talked about on the inside, you're unlocking value. And that's what we're trying to do. Thank you for joining the session. I hope to see you next time.